Hello, this is a lecture for Chapter 13 about the Civil War. The essential question for this chapter is how and why did the Union win the Civil War? Remember, as we're going through this, you should be either taking notes or going through a study guide, writing down essential questions. And if I go too fast, make sure you pause, rewind, make sure you go through all of these notes. So here we go. When the war initially starts, the North and South are filled with volunteers. Thousands of men would volunteer to fight on both sides of the army. In the South, the president, named Jefferson Davis, says that they are fighting for self government, that they can control themselves. Um, Even though Abraham Lincoln said that when he would be elected, he would not interfere with slavery, he and other Southerners would not believe them. Lincoln, in turn, said that secession was attack on representative government, and that it was going against the Constitution. And so, throughout the war, Lincoln is going to um, claim that the South and its secession is illegal. They're going to claim that these people are in rebellion, but never claim or acknowledge that they are a separate country. And so when the war begins, the two sides have very different strategies. The South strategy is defense. They know that they have less production in manufacturing than the North. And so they're going to count on their production of cotton um, and trade with other countries and possibly develop good enough relationships with these European nations that they might actually help in the war. They also know that fighting is probably going to take place in the South where they have a home field advantage. They know where roads are, where rivers are. They know the best way to attack and use the land. And it's going to give Southerners a big advantage. The North has a much more difficult task. They have to go down into the South and force them to rejoin the Union, the North. And so they're going to create an economic blockade using the Navy, which means they're going to take all their ships and sail around the South to stop them from trading with other nations. They're going to attack the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. There's this belief at this in 1800s warfare that if you take the enemy's capital, you win the war. And they're going to hold on to border states that we're going to talk about in just a minute. Okay, and here you can see this is called the Great Snake. General Scott was the lead general of the Northern troops at the time, and you can see the it's supposed to be like an anaconda, where you have the boats are sailing around the South and making sure they don't trade with any other country, cutting them off from Europe. So I said before the North is going to try to take over Richmond, and they try to do that right away. They believe that if they can do that fast, the war could end in just a couple months. The first battle takes place just outside of Richmond, Virginia, near a small creek called Bull Run. And at this first battle, the North loses a major victory. It's the first major battle of the war. It's a Southern victory, and it leads off a series of Southern victories for the first couple years of the war. And seemingly, after almost every one of these large battles, Lincoln begins firing generals who failed in battle. He would initially fire the first general who lost that first battle and hire this guy, George McClellan, um, who the men really liked. He was a good planner, he was a good preparer for battles, but then when the fighting actually came, he was always too cautious. In the Peninsula Campaign, which sought to take over Richmond, Virginia, he led a very slow advance and always thought that the South had more men than they really did, and it ultimately failed, and he too would be fired. So a key strategy that I mentioned in this slide a couple slides ago was about border states. See, border states are the states in red in that map there, where slavery is legal, but they decided not to secede. They remained loyal to the Union. And another change was the western counties of Virginia decided to break away and stay loyal to the North. Eventually, this would become the state of West Virginia. In the border state of Maryland, Lincoln would order the arrest of Confederate sympathizers to ensure they would not secede. There was a fear that people who were pro-South would turn a state to um, and convince them to secede and join the South. And so Lincoln would suspend this idea called habeas corpus, which protected people from being arbitrarily arrested. So that means that people didn't actually have to commit a crime. Lincoln and Northern forces would arrest people who they suspected of causing disloyal activities. Also during this time, General Grant begins moving down the Mississippi River right here into Kentucky and Tennessee, taking some of these border states and ensuring they would not leave. One of the major battles in this time happened in Tennessee at the Battle of Shiloh, which left over 20,000 people dead or wounded, which is the highest amount of people dead in a battle up to that point. The Southern General Robert E. Lee, who becomes probably the most famous general of the war, in 1862 decided to go on the offensive. So he kind of goes against their initial plan of a defensive strategy, and they invade Maryland. The plan was that perhaps when the Southern Army gets to Maryland, that state would decide to secede and join the South. Even though he was outnumbered, he would fight to the north at the Battle of Antietam. And over a series of fights during a single day, neither side really won or lost. However, Lee did decide to return to the South. If you combine both sides, casualties, over 4,800 people were killed, which is the deadliest day in American history. After this battle, the Northern General McClellan, who I said was cautious, decided not to pursue Lee and chase after him. And Lincoln was so fed up with him by this time, he fired McClellan for good. But don't worry, we'll hear from McClellan again later. Okay, there's Abraham Lincoln coming to visit McClellan right after the battle. Now, throughout the war so far, Northern abolitionists have been calling to end slavery. Early in the war, runaway enslaved people would run away to the Union armies, would try to ask them to protect them. They would camp with the soldiers, and they became known as contrabands. Eventually, Congress would pass a law called the Confiscation Act, which said that any of these refugee slaves who made it to northern camps would be forever freed. Now, early on, Lincoln did not agree with emancipation as a war aim. He believed that saving the Union was the primary goal of the war. Here's a group of refugee slaves who would run to the Union Army at Cumberland Landing. Eventually, they would be freed. This is a famous letter written by Lincoln that kind of showed what his goal for the war is, where he says, "My paramount object in the struggle is to save the Union. It is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union. So whatever he does, it's all about the Union and helping to unite the country again. But this does signal to some people that Lincoln might be changing his mind on slavery because he's talking for the first time about possibly freeing slaves. He began hinting that emancipating slaves could hurt the South. It could hurt their ability to fight in the war. However, he believed if he did it, he would need to have a Northern victory first. And so far in the war, there haven't been very many victories. Even though Antietam was kind of a draw, neither side really won. He believed that Antietam was close enough to a victory. And so he would use the Emancipation Proclamation to be issued at the beginning of the next year. And it would say slavery would be abolished in all rebellious states. So all the states that seceded and left the country, all those slaves would be freed. But this means that any slaves in border states would not be freed. Those enslaved people would remain in bondage. He also said that southern states could keep their slaves if they came back and rejoined the North. However, no southern states would take up the offer, which led to very few slaves being actually freed. If you're a southern state like Georgia and you hear that President Lincoln is saying your slaves are freed now, Georgia's just going to say, no, we're not going to listen to you. We're rebelling. We're in rebellion. We're our own country now. And so very few slaves were actually freed. The big reason why this is such a big deal, even though it didn't actually free that many enslaved people, is that it, one, persuaded Europe to side with the North, because Europe by this time had freed their slaves, but also because this is the first major change in the national government that would show anti-slavery action. But to really make sure that enslaved people would be freed in the future, they would need military victories. They would need to win the war. And this isn't happening yet. Here you can see one image showing Abraham Lincoln talking to his cabinet, explaining to them the Emancipation Proclamation. But here is Lincoln writing the Emancipation Proclamation from a Southern perspective. And here Lincoln looks like an animal. He's using an inkwell from the devil. His foot is on a book which is supposed to represent the Constitution. And he's got pictures of John Brown, who the South demonized, but he's got a picture of him with an angel's halo on the top. And this is supposed to represent a picture of the Haitian Rebellion, where African slaves would rise up and kill all their slave masters. So this is a negative perspective on the same event. And here in this map, you can see what the Emancipation Proclamation actually does. All the areas in red are places where slaves are supposed to be freed, but we just heard that very few slaves were actually freed in those areas. And the areas in blue, those are areas where there was slavery, but the Emancipation Proclamation did not demand those slaves to be freed. Now, in the North, their economy was built for this type of war. They had more factories that could manufacture products needed for a war. Wars are expensive, and wars require factories to build the stuff that you need for your war. The North is investing in transportation systems to move goods and supplies for the war effort, especially in the form of railroads. The North is imposing high tariffs to make more money. They're giving away free land to farmers out west, hoping that they will produce wheat and other grains to give to the soldiers. They started building a transcontinental railroad that would go across the Great Plains and connect the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. And the government is spending a lot of money. In the beginning of the war, they spent about $63 million a year. By the end of the war, they were spending $865 million in a year. And that's really expensive. They did print some paper currency called greenbacks that anyone in the whole country could use, which is very different. Before this time period, you might have different paper money based on what state you live in, or a bank might print their own money. In this case, these greenbacks that the national government is creating, everyone has to accept it, no matter where you are in the country. Now, initially, the South is kind of letting their individual states deal with all the issues. Remember, they believed in states' rights, and they didn't want to force states to do anything. But as the war is going on, they realize that they need to tell states what to do. They need to do things as a Southern government. And so the Southern government created shipyards and armories, foundries, mills. They created prices for goods. They created taxes, which the people really didn't like. And as time goes on, the South needs to find a way to pay for all this stuff that they're spending, and so they decide to print paper money. That's how they pay for most of the stuff in the war, and this created very high inflation. The South also created what's called the 1/10 tax, where all farmers had to turn over 10% of their crops to the government, which really shows the power of this supposed national government, which seemed to be really against the whole idea of a states' rights government. Many southern cities would erupt in riots, especially among women, when the prices of food like bread would increase dramatically because of the high inflation. Now, both the North and the South need more men. The amount of volunteers early in the war wasn't cutting it. So both sides would eventually create a draft. The South had some exceptions, like they would exempt a white man for every 20 enslaved people they owned. So that meant a white plantation owner would not have to go and fight if they owned more than 20 enslaved people. If they owned 40 slaves, they would also be able to exempt an overseer who would watch over the slaves in the fields. And every 20 people that they enslaved would exempt one more white man from having to fight. Both the North and the South had a substitution program where you could pay money to the government, $200 or whatever it was, and then you wouldn't have to go and fight. Some southern states would ignore the draft completely and just not send soldiers to go and fight. In the North, many Irish immigrants would refuse to serve. They said it wasn't their fight. And in the North, while the Republicans were fighting for executing the war, many Northern Democrats began to fight for anti-war sentiment to try to get more support. Just like in the South, there were draft riots in the North, like in New York City, where many immigrants, especially Irish immigrants, would attack and kill some African Americans in the city who they blamed for the war. Here's a woodcut where riots would in New York City would kill African Americans, and eventually even destroying and burning down an orphanage for African American children, which is really terrible. The Emancipation Proclamation also allowed African American men to serve in the military. However, them serving in the military was on the condition that they served in segregated units. That meant they could not fight alongside white soldiers, and African Americans could not be officers in the military. Initially, they were paid less than white soldiers. They'd be paid $10 a month, while white soldiers were paid $13 a month. But despite that, over 180,000 African Americans would volunteer. And Lincoln claimed that they helped turn the tide of the war. However, when black soldiers fought, and eventually, if there were soldiers that surrendered, um, the South said that any African American soldiers who were captured would be treated as runaway slaves trying to start an insurrection and would immediately be put to death. There were some cases where this happened right away on the battlefield, like at the Battle of Fort Pillow, where the Southern general Nathan Bedford Forrest ordered his men to kill black soldiers who were surrendering. Ultimately, this led to the end of prisoner exchanges between the North and the South. To help win the war and help the soldiers specifically, New Yorkers created the U.S. Sanitary Commission, which is a group meant to provide soldiers with clothing, food, medical services, doctors, nurses. Um, and their goal was to clean up camp life for soldiers because disease was running rampant in the camps. In fact, more people died of disease during the Civil War than by dying in battle. The Sanitary Commission would help cut deaths in camps, and the South really didn't have a system like this. Women were vital to fighting in the war. While women were not allowed to serve in the military, women would work as clerks and work in factories. They would take over farm responsibilities. They would serve in the U.S. Sanitary Commission. Some women would work as spies and scouts for the military, and even some would dress up like men and fight in the military, kind of like Mulan. And so for the first couple of years, the war is going very badly for the North. And there's a lot of support for saying, let's just be done with the war, let's have a peace, and just be done with it. The South is winning these major victories, like the Battle of Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville. And so to help win the war, Ulysses S. Grant is a Northern general who attacks going down the Mississippi River. And they know if they control the Mississippi River, they would make sure that they could travel up and down and would stop the South from using it to transport goods, men, and crops. The last area that the South had control of on the Mississippi River was a city on top of a hill called Vicksburg. He would lead a siege, so he would completely surround the city, and every day, every hour, they would be shooting cannons into the city, destroying people's homes, firing into Southern soldiers. And would eventually win this Battle of Vicksburg and lead the North to controlling the entire Mississippi River. While this is happening, General Lee believes his army is invincible, and he invades the North for a second time, this time going all the way up into Pennsylvania. There, he fights at the Battle of Gettysburg, and over the course of 3 days, he would decide to lead a dangerous frontal assault known as Pickett's Charge, walking across over a mile of open ground, and his men were destroyed. It was a Southern catastrophe, and the battle would lead to huge casualties on both sides. However, Lee would escape back to the South, which is a major Northern victory. And this battle, and this is very important, would be a turning point in the war for the North. Later that year, with the thousands of American dead, they had to bury them somewhere. They created a national cemetery just in the outskirts of the town. To commemorate the opening of the cemetery, they decided to invite Abraham Lincoln to speak, and there he gave the Gettysburg Address. He quoted the Declaration of Independence, saying that all men are created equal, and he called for the war to lead to a new birth of freedom. And so this is him again signaling that the war is beginning to change, that the war is not just about keeping the country together, but it's also about freedom. Here you can see some pictures of dead soldiers from the Battle of Gettysburg. One really weird thing about this picture is that this dead man did not die here. He died actually further away from here, and the photographer dragged his body to this spot because he thought it would look like a good picture. So that's kind of weird. Here you can see more soldiers. Now, Grant, who won the Battle of Vicksburg, was well liked by Abraham Lincoln. He becomes the most popular general in the army, and he is put in charge of all Union armies. And so he begins attacks on all major Confederate armies. He knew that it would lead to heavy casualties, but he also knew that it would lead to the end of the war. And so he's going to order one of his generals, William Tecumseh, this should be Sherman, to go down into Georgia and lead total war tactics, which is destroying towns and farms and anything that could help the South win the war, they would destroy it. While General Grant would attack Richmond and follow Lee around until he surrenders. This would lead to vicious battles over and over and over again. That year in 1864, there's another presidential election. The Democratic Party nominates ex-General George McClellan, he's back, who wanted to end the idea of emancipation and end the war. Lincoln said, no, we got to keep going until there is unconditional surrender. And he also called for a constitutional amendment to abolish slavery. Now, right before the election happened, General Sherman, there he is, would capture the city of Atlanta, Georgia, which was a major Northern victory. And then just a few weeks later, Lincoln would win a clear victory in the presidential election. By this time, border states realized that the pathway or the tide is turning against slavery. And so border states began to end slavery one at a time. And then at the beginning of 1865, Congress approves the 13th Amendment that ends slavery in the United States. While this is happening, Sherman marches across Georgia, destroying property, and even issues a new field order, which would take land away from plantation owners and give it to freed people. However, in many cases, this would not come to fruition for the freed people, and we'll find out in our next chapter that that freedmen would be kind of left out to dry by the government. And very quickly, the South is collapsing. General Robert E. Lee surrenders to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. And the war is pretty much over by this point. Over 700,000 people are dead, and America has to rebuild. That's where we're going to end the chapter here, everybody. If you have any questions, please ask your teacher. Thank you.